With the Bandidos Motorcycle Club be disarmed. It's a case going through the Milam County Court right now, and one defense attorney says it could set a dangerous precedent.
How do you defeat an outlaw empire that thrives on fear, loyalty, and roaring engines? Not with louder guns, but with patience, pressure, and time. This story follows the Bandidos through rival wars, betrayals, and invisible enemies who never wore patches. From parking lots soaked in blood to courtrooms stacked with files, every move tightened the noose. What happens when the road disappears, the money freezes, the phones go silent, and the future stops caring? No sirens warn of the ending. Jeff Pike's Kingdom, the day Texas stopped belonging to the Bandidos.
Our Bill Barajas tells us both are now waiting on the sentencing phase.
We heard a lot about the split on the far right, it's the old patch.
These vests and their...
Jeff Pike didn't build the Bandidos' Texas reputation with speeches. He built it with rules. In his world, a patch wasn't decoration, it was a deed. You didn't simply ride through a county, host a rally, or open a clubhouse without the proper nod. There were protocols, phone calls, intermediaries, and the quiet sentence that meant everything. We're passing through your territory. That's how an outlaw empire stays stable. And that's why the challenge from the Cossacks felt like a direct strike at the crown. For years, the Cossacks were smaller, hungrier, and louder about it. They wore their colors like an argument, showing up at events where the Bandidos expected automatic deference. Whispers followed them. They refused to pay tax. They didn't ask permission. They didn't treat Texas like someone else's kingdom. In the biker world, that isn't stubbornness. It's a provocation that forces a response, because if one club gets away with it, the whole hierarchy collapses. Then came Waco, May 17, 2015. Twin Peaks was supposed to be a routine gathering, the kind of midday meetup where men in leather talk business over plates of food, pretending normal life still exists. Instead, it turned into a parking lot war. Dozens of bikes rolled in, then more. The atmosphere wasn't festive, it was loaded. Two groups circling the same space, reading every stare, every step, every hand drifting too close to a waistband. The first shove looked small. The first insult sounded ordinary, and then it snapped. Gunfire ripped across the lot so fast that witnesses couldn't tell who shot first. People dropped behind motorcycles, crawled under tables, and clutched pistols with shaking hands. 9 men died. More than 20 were wounded. Brass casings covered the ground like spilled gravel, and the air tasted like burned powder and panic. Police swarmed in, and the public story became chaos. But inside the culture, the deeper story was control. The Bandidos had always treated Texas as home base, the place their identity anchored. The Cossacks weren't outsiders invading from another state. They were Texans too, and that made the defiance personal. A rival from the same soil doesn't just threaten territory, it threatens the myth that only one set of colors can rule the Lone Star State. After Waco, the crackdown was immediate. More than 170 bikers were rounded up, photographed, processed, and turned into headlines. To law enforcement, it looked like a chance to smash 2 violent networks at once. To the clubs, it felt like the state picking a side, because arrests don't erase grudges, they sharpen them. The real aftermath didn't happen on camera. It happened in the months and years that followed, when clubhouses tightened security, when smaller crews chose allies, when men stopped riding alone. Rumors of revenge floated through Texas, bars like cigarette smoke. Bikes were watched, homes were checked twice. Names were said carefully. The message lingered in the silence. Question the kingdom, and you inherit the funeral. In the world, respect is currency, and debts get collected violently. Waco didn't end a feud. It exposed the price of breaking protocol, and it proved that in Jeff Pike's Texas, peace was never peace. It was only the pause before the next engine roared. Ruben Doc Cavazos and the Pacific Line, when the Mongols refused to kneel. Ruben Doc Cavazos built the Mongols with a memory of exclusion and a taste for defiance. Founded by Vietnam veterans who were turned away from other clubs, the Mongols learned early that respect was never given. It was taken. That lesson followed them across California deserts and city streets, shaping a culture that never bowed to outside authority. So, when the Bandidos began drifting west, carrying their Texas-born confidence toward the Pacific, Cavazos's legacy hovered over every encounter like a warning flare. The West had its own rules. California, Arizona, and Nevada weren't empty highways waiting for conquest. They were already mapped by bloodlines, alliances, and grudges that stretched back decades. The Mongols had survived wars with bigger enemies before, most notably the Hells Angels, and they emerged hardened by that conflict. To them, the Bandidos weren't kings arriving to claim land. They were challengers stepping onto ground that had already been defended. The tension didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly. Biker bars suddenly felt watched. Support clubs were pressured to choose sides. Bikes were followed a little too closely on desert highways. Then came the violence that never made the front page, but circulated through law enforcement briefings and biker rumor mills. Drive-by shootings outside club-friendly spots. Bikes were torched in parking lots overnight. Men beaten badly enough to send a message without creating a martyr. Las Vegas changed the tone of everything. In 2002, violence between the Mongols and the Hells Angels spilled into public view at a casino, proving that the Mongols weren't afraid to bring war into places meant for tourists and cameras. The Bandidos paid attention. That incident wasn't their fight, but it was a signal. Any westward expansion would meet a club willing to go loud, fast, and public if pushed. As Bandidos chapters pressed closer, the Mongols responded through pressure instead of parades. Smaller clubs were warned. Affiliates were flipped or punished. In Arizona and Nevada, law enforcement intercepted communications that hinted at meetings that were really ambushes, peace talks that ended with broken bones and stripped vests. In one widely discussed case, a Bandido support club member was found shot and left near his burned motorcycle, his colors taken as a trophy. The Mongols called it justice. The Bandidos called it a line crossed. What frustrated the Bandidos most was structure. Their hierarchy depended on leadership, ranks, and chains of command. The Mongols didn't move that way. They operated like cells, each chapter loyal but not dependent, making decapitation impossible. Arrest one leader and nothing stopped. Shut down one clubhouse and another surfaced somewhere else. It was a strategy born from survival, and it worked. By the late 20s, federal agencies described the rivalry as contained but volatile. No declared war, no treaties, just a constant hum of readiness. Both sides adjusted tactics, favoring infiltration, financial pressure, and proxy conflicts over open gunfights. Violence didn't disappear. It went quieter, more surgical, harder to trace. Underneath it all was identity. The Bandidos saw themselves as empire builders, spreading a code from Texas outward. The Mongols saw themselves as guardians of independence, allergic to anyone claiming dominance over their land. In the chrome reflections of their bikes, each side saw the same thing staring back: pride, defiance, and the certainty that riding second was never an option. Frank Hannebuth's European line. When the Hells Angels turned the continent into a war zone, Frank Hannebuth understood Europe the way generals understand terrain. As the public face of the Hells Angels in Germany, he didn't just oversee chapters. He managed balance. Borders mattered, cities mattered, and reputation mattered most of all. So when the Bandidos crossed the Atlantic in the late 1980 seconds, they didn't arrive as guests. They arrived as a challenge to an order that had already been enforced with fear. At first, it looked like expansion without blood. A new chapter here, a new clubhouse there. But in Scandinavia, the Hells Angels were already deeply rooted, especially around Copenhagen. Their influence wasn't loud, it was assumed. That's why the Bandidos opening a chapter in Helsingør felt less like competition and more like an invasion. The message was clear. Texas colors were claiming European asphalt. The war reached a point of no return in 1996. A rocket-propelled grenade was fired into a Hells Angels clubhouse near Copenhagen Airport. The blast killed a young woman who had nothing to do with either club and injured several others. That single moment changed everything. It pulled governments into a conflict they could no longer ignore. Special anti-biker units were formed almost overnight. Surveillance increased. Raids became routine. Behind the scenes, The conflict was about hierarchy. The Hells Angels viewed Europe as theirs, earned through decades of intimidation and control. Frank Hannibeth's approach was calculated. He didn't need constant explosions. He needed pressure, strategic alliances with smaller clubs, quiet warnings delivered through intermediaries. The Bandidos responded with their own structure, enforcing discipline and loyalty across borders. The result was a chess match, played with bullets instead of pieces. Each side testing limits, probing weaknesses, waiting for mistakes. By 1997, exhaustion set in. Police pressure intensified, and behind closed doors, negotiations began. The Great Nordic Biker War officially ended on paper. But paper doesn't erase memory. The hatred didn't disappear. It went underground. Turf disputes shifted into drug routes. Recruitment battles replaced public shootouts. Silence became the new battlefield. Even decades later, the scars remain. In Germany and Denmark, a single sighting of Bandido colors can still trigger police alerts. Clubhouses are monitored, movements tracked. The legacy of that war reshaped European outlaw culture. It proved these clubs weren't loose gangs. They were organized, strategic, and willing to escalate beyond imagination. For the Bandidos, surviving Europe was a badge of honor. For the Hells Angels, holding ground reinforced their myth. Frank Hannibeth didn't just defend territory. He defended a reputation built on fear. And in Europe, that reputation was paid for with blood, burned buildings, and a generation that learned one hard truth. Expansion always comes with resistance, and resistance always demands a price. Anthony "Snoddy" Spencer and the Australian Schism. When brotherhood turned into execution, Anthony "Snoddy" Spencer didn't leave the Comancheros quietly. In the outlaw world, quiet exits don't exist. When Spencer broke from Jock Ross's iron control in the early 1980s, he didn't just walk away from a club, he detonated it. What followed would become one of the most violent chapters in biker history, and the moment the Bandidos transformed from an American outlaw club into a global force written in blood. The Comancheros were already powerful in Australia, feared and deeply entrenched. Ross ruled with discipline and punishment, and for some members, that rule crossed from order into suffocation. Spencer and a group of defectors believed the club had become a prison disguised as a brotherhood. They wanted autonomy, a voice, and power without submission. When they discovered the Bandidos in the United States, they found more than allies. They found an identity that promised rebellion with structure. Patching over to the Bandidos wasn't symbolic, it was an act of war. Overnight, former brothers became traitors. Colors that once rode together now marked targets. Tension built fast, especially in Sydney, where both clubs moved through the same streets and swap meets, daring each other to blink. No one did. The explosion came on Father's Day, September 2, 1984, at a motorcycle swap meet in Milpera. Two groups arrived, knowing exactly who the other was. Witnesses described the air as electric, a silence heavy with intent. A single shot broke it. Then everything collapsed into chaos. Gunfire echoed across the parking lot. Machetes swung. Civilians ran. When it ended, 6 bikers lay dead. So did 14-year-old Leanne Walters, an innocent caught in a war she didn't belong to. Australia had never seen violence like it. The Milpera massacre shattered the illusion that biker conflicts were fringe disputes. It forced lawmakers, police, and the public to confront the reality of organized outlaw warfare. The Bandidos were no longer just an imported club. They were now tied forever to one of the country's darkest criminal moments. For the Bandidos, the massacre became a grim origin story. Blood had sealed their presence. They weren't guests in Australia anymore. They were entrenched. For the Comancheros, it was a wound that never healed. Retaliation followed in waves. Shootings, bombings, beatings in alleyways and club car parks. Even when leadership changed and generations passed, the hatred stayed alive, passed down like an inheritance. But suppression didn't end the war. It reshaped it. By the 1920 seconds, the conflict shifted into drugs, extortion, and shadow networks. The clubs adapted. They always do. Yet, beneath the new tactics, The old betrayal remained the core wound. The Comancheros saw Spencer's defection as treason. The Bandidos saw it as liberation bought at a terrible price. Milpera taught the outlaw world a permanent lesson. When loyalty breaks, it doesn't fade, it detonates. And once blood is spilled between brothers, there is no peace, only pauses between funerals. James Big Jim, Nolan, and the Midwest Mirror. When the outlaws stood their ground, James Big Jim, Nolan believed in old rules. The kind written before social media, before flashy headlines, before outlaw clubs became brands. To Nolan and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, respect wasn't negotiated, it was enforced. That mindset is what kept the Outlaws powerful across the Midwest and parts of the South long before the Bandidos ever thundered out of Texas. And it's exactly why their collision was inevitable. For decades, the two clubs existed in parallel. The Bandidos dominated Texas and the Southwest. The Outlaws controlled Illinois, Ohio, and large stretches of the Midwest. There was an unspoken understanding. You stay on your side, we stay on ours. But expansion changes everything. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Bandidos began pushing east, not loudly, but deliberately. A new hangout here, a support club is there. To the Outlaws, it looked like encroachment disguised as coincidence. The Bandidos answered in their own language. Retaliation wasn't theatrical, it was coordinated. In states like Louisiana and Mississippi, confrontations ended with emergency room visits and police reports that named no suspects. Law enforcement began noticing patterns, two clubs crossing paths, violence following, silence afterward. Both sides understood the code. Talk to the police, and you're finished. What made this rivalry especially dangerous was the similarity. Both clubs were structured, disciplined, and deeply rooted in tradition. Both believed in hierarchy, enforcement, and the idea that disrespect must be punished publicly enough to discourage imitation. No hotheads were driving this conflict, there were strategists. By the early 2000s, federal agencies stepped in. The ATF began tracking both clubs, focusing on weapons trafficking and organized retaliation. Intelligence reports showed how support clubs were used as buffers, absorbing risk while protecting core leadership. Bars and rallies became pressure points. A gathering wasn't just social, it was reconnaissance. One incident in Louisiana captured the nature of the feud. After an Outlaws-linked event, a nearby Bandido-friendly bar was riddled with gunfire late at night. No one was killed, but the message was unmistakable. 2 nights later, several Outlaws members were assaulted outside a diner by masked riders. No colors worn, no arrests made, balance restored, at least temporarily. Unlike Waco or Milpera, there was no single massacre to define this war. That was by design. Both clubs understood that public bloodshed invites unwanted attention. Instead, they waged a shadow conflict, one that bled slowly and quietly. Law enforcement called it restraint. Insiders called it discipline. Over time, an uneasy truce formed. Territories hardened. Boundaries were respected again, not out of friendship, but out of exhaustion and mutual capability. Neither side forgot. They simply waited. James Big Jim Nolan represented everything the Bandidos saw in themselves, a reflection. Another brotherhood built on loyalty, fear, and memory. And that's what made the Outlaws dangerous. They weren't chaos, they were ordered. And when two orders collide on the same road, one mistake is all it takes to turn silence back into gunfire. They thrived in places where law enforcement coverage thinned and rival clubs underestimated the terrain. The Bandidos, expanding with Texas confidence, saw opportunity. The Vagos saw an invasion. And unlike other rivals, the Vagos didn't rely on noise or numbers. They relied on precision. The early years of the conflict stayed mostly invisible. Men followed each other off highways. Support clubs were pressured quietly. Bikes disappeared. Safe houses were compromised. Law enforcement reports from the early 2000s described ambush-style assaults in rural counties, attacks designed to wound or humiliate rather than kill. The goal wasn't headlines, it was control. Everything changed in September 2011. A motorcycle rally at the Nugget Casino in Sparks, Nevada, turned into an execution. Jeffrey Pettigrew was shot and killed in the open, surrounded by other bikers and civilians. Investigators later tied the killing to rival club violence, naming Vagos and Bandidos associates in the fallout. The message hit hard across the outlaw world. If a leader like Pettigrew could be taken out in public, no one was untouchable. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Retaliation rippled across state lines. Clubhouses were fortified. Members stopped riding solo. In deserts outside Las Vegas and along the California-Nevada border, bodies began turning up in places meant to erase evidence. Bikes were found stripped and burned, cuts missing. A signature warning in biker culture that words weren't necessary. What made the Vagos conflict different was geography. The desert favors those who know it. The Vagos used isolation as a weapon, forcing confrontations far from cameras and witnesses. The Bandidos responded with structure, sending enforcers and trusted members to reclaim what they believed was theirs by right of expansion. It became a chess match, played under a sun that forgives nothing. Federal agencies scrambled to contain it. Multi-agency task forces raided homes, seized weapons, and intercepted communications, referencing retaliation raids and border enforcement. Despite the pressure, the violence didn't stop. It adapted. Shootings became rarer. Disappearances became more common. Silence replaced spectacle. For the Bandidos, Pettigrew's death marked a turning point. The West was no longer a future prize. It was an active war zone. For the Vagos, it was a rallying cry. Pettigrew became a martyr, his name invoked as justification for every strike that followed. Each side hardened its position, convinced the other wouldn't stop until one faded away. André Spider Desjardins and the Canadian betrayal, the night Brotherhood died. André Spider Desjardins knew what it felt like to be hunted. Long before the Bandidos ever reached Canada, Desjardins had survived a war that rewrote the country's criminal history. The Rock Machine had battled the Hells Angels across Quebec in the 1990s, leaving more than 100 dead. By the time the dust settled, the Rock Machine was shattered, its leaders imprisoned or killed, its members scattered and desperate. Survival required reinvention. That's when Texas answered. When the Bandidos welcomed Rock Machine survivors into their ranks in the early 2000s, it looked like salvation. New colors, new protection, a chance to stand upright again. Desjardins and others patched over, forming Bandidos Canada. On paper, it was a merger. In reality, it was a marriage built on suspicion. Old wounds don't heal just because patches change. From the beginning, tension simmered between Canadian chapters and American leadership. Money moved south. Orders came down that didn't fit local realities. Veterans who had fought for survival under Desjardins bristled at taking commands from men who hadn't bled in Quebec streets. Loyalty became conditional. Whispers of theft, betrayal, and disobedience circulated quietly, the most dangerous phase of any outlaw relationship. By 2005, fractures were impossible to hide. Chapters are split into factions. Some swore loyalty to Texas. Others stayed with Desjardins and local leadership. Meetings grew tense. Security tightened. Members arrived armed not just against rivals, but against each other. The warning signs were everywhere, and no one stopped it. The Shedden massacre sent shockwaves through the outlaw world. Canada woke up to headlines describing bikers murdered execution style by fellow members. For the Bandidos, the damage was catastrophic. Their entire Canadian presence collapsed overnight. Arrests followed. Trials dragged on. The brand that had promised unity now symbolized betrayal. For Desjardins and former Rock Machine loyalists, Shedden became proof of everything they feared. The Bandidos hadn't offered a partnership. They demanded obedience. In the aftermath, the Rock Machine name resurfaced, resurrected by men who felt burned by Texas leadership. Old flags were raised again, this time fueled by vengeance rather than ambition. Violence followed, though quieter than before. Drive-by shootings, arson attacks, intimidation campaigns aimed at reminding everyone that Canada wasn't finished fighting. Law enforcement labeled it a second biker war, smaller but colder, driven by memory rather than conquest. Trust had evaporated. Alliances meant nothing. For the Bandidos, Canada became a lesson written in blood. Expansion without cohesion invites collapse. Control without trust breeds rebellion. The Shedden massacre wasn't just a loss of territory, it was the death of an idea. That brotherhood alone could hold an empire together. In the frozen fields of Ontario, loyalty ended that night, and every outlaw who heard the story learned the same truth. The most dangerous enemy isn't always across the border. Sometimes he's standing beside you, wearing the same colors, waiting for the order to pull the trigger. Geoffrey Jethro Pettigrew and the Desert Line. When the Vagos turned the West into a graveyard, Geoffrey Jethro Pettigrew carried himself like a man who believed the desert listened. As president of the Vagos Motorcycle Club's San Jose chapter, he understood the West differently than outsiders ever could. The desert wasn't empty, it was controlled. Every highway exit, every casino parking lot, every remote stretch of asphalt had a history, and that history was defended with violence. When the Bandidos pushed west, they weren't entering neutral ground. They were riding straight into Pettigrew's domain. The Vagos had long been the dominant force across California, Nevada, and Arizona. Their green patches were warnings, not decoration. Aguilar became one of the most visible faces of that split. Known for his calm demeanor and willingness to confront authority, he represented everything the kinfolk claimed to stand for: independence, equality, freedom from what they called forced loyalty. The name Kinfolk wasn't accidental, it was a provocation, a reminder that this new club was built by men who once shared rides, prison time, and secrets with the Bandidos. Tension exploded on July 30, 2017 in El Paso, Texas. At a bar called Mulligan's Chopped Hog, a Bandido and a Kinfolk member crossed paths. Words turned into fists. Fists turned into gunfire. Aguilar shot and killed Juan Compa Martinez, a high-ranking Bandido. Security footage later showed it wasn't a random scuffle. It was a moment charged with history and hate. The killing sent shockwaves through Texas. For the Bandidos, it wasn't just murder, it was symbolic execution. A former brother killing a leader shattered any illusion of reconciliation. Within hours, both clubs went into lockdown. Law enforcement flooded the area. The ATF labeled the shooting part of a growing outlaw war, but insiders knew this wasn't a new feud. It was a family war finally going public. After El Paso, the roads changed. Bars canceled biker events. Clubhouses reinforced security. Members stopped riding alone. The kinfolk expanded quickly, recruiting disillusioned ex-bandidos who felt betrayed by national leadership. Every new kinfolk patch was seen as an insult, a reminder that loyalty had failed. The Bandidos responded the only way they knew how: pressure, intimidation, retaliation. Cars were firebombed, homes vandalized, kinfolk members were beaten or disappeared without explanation. The violence stayed mostly out of sight, unfolding in alleys and parking lots where cameras didn't linger. Law enforcement cracked down, but arrests only hardened positions. Ronnie the King, Bruinsma, and the silent streets. When Satudarah broke the Bandidos' code, Ronnie the King, Bruinsma never cared for tradition. Where most outlaw clubs wrapped themselves in decades of ritual and hierarchy, Bruinsma built Satudarah like a street empire. Multicultural, ruthless, and fast, the club didn't ask for legitimacy. It took space and dared anyone to challenge it. That attitude became a problem when the Bandidos pushed deeper into Europe and discovered an enemy that didn't recognize their rules. Satudarah rose out of the Netherlands in the early 2010s, pulling members from Indonesian, Surinamese, and Dutch street crews. Their loyalty wasn't built on old biker mythology. It was built on identity and survival. When the Bandidos began expanding from Germany toward Dutch border towns, they expected resistance from traditional rivals. What they didn't expect was a club that refused diplomacy entirely. The first confrontations felt chaotic. Bars were attacked without warning. Bikes were torched in daylight. Members were beaten so brutally that the message was unmistakable. This wasn't intimidation meant to negotiate territory. It was violence meant to erase presence. Police surveillance later showed convoys moving with military timing, striking and vanishing before patrols could react. Bruinsma's leadership style was unreadable to outsiders. No clear hierarchy, no obvious command chain. Arrest one figure and nothing changed. The Bandidos, used to structured warfare, struggled to apply pressure. Their usual tool, negotiation through intermediaries, targeted warnings, and controlled retaliation, failed. Satudarah didn't respond to signals. They responded to the opportunity. By 2014, the conflict had spilled openly across the Netherlands and Germany. Shootouts erupted near clubhouses. Stabbings followed. Authorities raided properties linked to both clubs, uncovering assault rifles, grenades, and body armor. Dutch media compared the violence to cartel wars, only fought on motorcycles instead of armored trucks. The cultural clash ran deeper than territory. The Bandidos represented order, hierarchy, and expansion. Satudarah represented chaos, speed, and adaptation. Bruinsma mocked the Bandidos as foreign occupiers clinging to outdated codes. The Bandidos dismissed Satudarah as undisciplined street thugs. Neither insult slowed the bloodshed. What unnerved law enforcement most was Satudarah's flexibility. When pressure mounted, they scattered. Chapters dissolved and reappeared under new banners. Members melted back into neighborhoods that protected them. The Bandidos, bound by structure and visibility, couldn't disappear the same way. Every raid weakened their position, while Satudarah kept moving. Governments responded with bans. Logos were outlawed, clubhouses shut down. Membership itself became criminalized. On paper, the war ended. In reality, it went underground. Small-scale clashes continued. Quiet assaults, targeted intimidation. A war stripped of patches, but not intent. Henk the Hammer Kuipers and the Eastern Push, when no surrender, rewrote the rules. Henk the Hammer Kuipers didn't believe in waiting for his turn. While traditional outlaw clubs argued over hierarchy and permission, Kuipers built the no-surrender motorcycle club like wildfire. Fast, aggressive, and unapologetically modern, No Surrender exploded across Europe in the early 2010s, recruiting riders who were tired of bowing to older empires. For the Bandidos, already bruised from wars with Satudarah and the Hells Angels, Kuipers represented something far more dangerous than a rival. He represented a future that didn't respect the past. No Surrender began in the Netherlands, but it didn't stay there. Within a few years, chapters appeared across Germany, Belgium, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Their growth wasn't subtle. They recruited ex-Bandidos, former Satudarah members, and independents who rejected strict chains of command. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To the Bandidos, it looked like mutiny spreading across borders. The first clashes were small but symbolic. Nightclub confrontations, fights at biker events, public insults exchanged on social media, something older clubs avoided. Kuipers understood the power of visibility. He didn't hide his defiance. He broadcast it. That alone broke an unwritten rule of outlaw culture, where wars are whispered, not posted. By 2015, violence followed the noise. In Dutch cities like Emmen and Groningen, shootouts erupted outside bars linked to both clubs. Bikes were torched. Members were beaten in broad daylight. Police later confirmed that many of these encounters were planned, with both sides arriving armed and ready. This wasn't a coincidence. It was provocation. As No Surrender pushed east, the rivalry traveled with them. In Germany, smaller motorcycle clubs were forced to choose sides. Those who didn't suffer consequences. Clubhouses were vandalized. Prospects disappeared. The Bandidos tried applying pressure through traditional means, warnings, intermediaries, and territorial claims. No Surrender ignored all of it. But bans don't erase loyalty. They just drive it underground. In Poland and Eastern Europe, both clubs reinvented themselves through front organizations and renamed chapters. The feud continued without patches, fueled by memory and resentment. Quiet stabbings, targeted intimidation, unexplained arson, a war no one officially acknowledged, but everyone felt. For the Bandidos, No Surrender was a generational threat, a club that rejected legacy, hierarchy, and permission. For Kuipers, the Bandidos were relics, symbols of an old order slowing progress. Their conflict wasn't just about territory, it was about time, old world against new. In the end, neither side truly won, but the damage was done. No surrender proved that outlaw power could grow without tradition, and the Bandidos learned a hard lesson. You can't intimidate what doesn't fear history. Eric Stone Rodriguez and the Houston Schism. When home turf turned hostile, and Eric Stone Rodriguez didn't arrive from another state to challenge the Bandidos. He rose from inside their shadow. Houston had always been the beating heart of Bandido country, the place where red and gold meant authority without explanation. For decades, no rival seriously questioned that control. That's why the emergence of Brothers East Motorcycle Club, known on the streets as B times East, felt less like competition and more like betrayal wrapped in ambition. Rodriguez became one of the most recognizable figures in that movement. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He organized. Brothers East formed around former prospects, disillusioned associates, and independent crews who felt suffocated by Bandido hierarchy. Their pitch was simple: freedom without permission, power without tribute. In a city long ruled by one party, that promise was explosive. The timing mattered. By the late 1922, the Bandidos were under heavy federal pressure. RICO cases had thinned leadership ranks. Surveillance was constant. For rivals, Houston looked vulnerable. Brothers East moved fast, recruiting aggressively and establishing a presence around bars, clubs, and narcotics routes the Bandidos had controlled for years. To the Bandidos, it wasn't expansion. It was an insurgency. The early clashes were subtle: tires slashed, threats delivered through intermediaries, vandalized club spaces. Each incident tested boundaries. When those warnings didn't slow Brothers East, violence escalated. By 2021, Houston saw a spike in shootings and stabbings tied to both groups. Masked bikers ambushed rivals outside strip malls and mechanic shops, disappearing before police arrived. To most residents, it looked like a random crime. To insiders, it was a war unfolding in plain sight. Federal authorities launched Operation Bloodlines to contain the fallout. What they uncovered painted a darker picture: encrypted messages, coordinated assaults, directives allegedly instructing members to smash on sight. The language was cold and deliberate. There would be no negotiation, no truce, just enforcement. For the Bandidos, Brothers East represented a dangerous evolution. They weren't bound by old biker mythology. They didn't care about national structures or permission from higher-ups. They were local, agile, and willing to absorb risk. Rodriguez understood that surviving against a giant meant staying unpredictable. Small cells, short movements, constant pressure. The Bandidos responded by reasserting dominance. Clubhouses were fortified, convoys became routine. Members watched each other's backs in public. The message was unmistakable. Houston was still Bandido territory. Anyone challenging that claim would pay a price. Retaliation followed, but it stayed mostly out of the spotlight. Quiet beatings, disappearances, warnings delivered without signatures. By 2025, indictments landed. 14 Bandido members and associates were charged in connection with violent acts tied to the Brothers East conflict. Prosecutors described it as an organized campaign of retribution. Brothers East members were also targeted, their movement disrupted but not erased. Keith Conan Richter and the East Coast Line. When the Pagans met Texas fire, Keith Conan Richter didn't rise by accident. He rose because he understood fear better than loyalty. Under his leadership, the Pagans Motorcycle Club transformed from a regional East Coast powerhouse into one of the most disciplined and violent outlaw organizations in America. Their rule stretched across Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and deep into the mid-Atlantic. For decades, that territory stayed untouched by Texas colors. Then the Bandidos began looking east. At first, the overlap was subtle. Support clubs switched allegiance. Independent riders started wearing red and gold at rallies where pagan dominance had once gone unquestioned. To Richter, this wasn't a coincidence. It was reconnaissance. The Pagans had built their empire on strict territorial control, and Richter believed that hesitation invited invasion. He didn't issue threats publicly. He prepared. The Bandidos were coming off heavy federal pressure in Texas, rebuilding leadership and searching for fresh ground. The Appalachian Corridor offered everything they needed: drug routes, gun pipelines, small towns where intimidation worked faster than law enforcement. To the Bandidos, it was an opportunity. To the Pagans, it was trespassing. The first documented clashes surfaced around 2018. At a rest stop along Interstate 81 in Virginia, a confrontation between pagan-linked riders and Bandido supporters escalated from shouting into gunfire. 2 men were wounded. No one cooperated. Investigators later tied the incident to disputes over meth distribution moving through the region. It wasn't random violence. It was a border test. Richter responded the way he always had, with structure. The Pagans fortified clubhouses, restricted movement, and tightened internal discipline. Intelligence intercepted by federal agencies later described pagan communications, referencing hold lines and defensive rides. The language wasn't emotional, it was strategic. The East Coast would not surrender without a fight. The Bandidos answered through pressure rather than parades. Recruitment increased among disillusioned mid-Atlantic riders tired of pagan control. Proxy clubs absorbed risk, clashing with pagan affiliates in parking lots, bars, and rural highways. Each side denied involvement. Each side understood exactly what was happening. By 2020, violence spread into Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of Ohio. Vehicles were burned. Members assaulted. Warning symbols appeared on walls and clubhouses. Law enforcement described it as an invisible war, one fought through intimidation rather than massacres. Both clubs had learned from past conflicts. Public bloodshed brought heat. Quiet violence bought time. What made the Richter-Bandido conflict especially volatile was parity. Unlike smaller rivals, the Pagans didn't fear the Bandidos. They respected their capacity, but respect didn't equal submission. Richter had built an organization capable of absorbing losses without collapsing. Decentralized but disciplined. Violent but controlled. Michael Iron Mike Lee and the Great Plains Pressure when the Homietos tested Texas. Michael Iron Mike Lee didn't come from legacy clubs or old biker families. He came from the margins, where riders learned early that survival mattered more than tradition. When the Homietos Motorcycle Club began spreading across Oklahoma, Kansas, and parts of North Texas in the early 20s, Lee became one of its most visible organizers. To outsiders, the Homietos looked like another fast-growing outlaw crew. To the Bandidos, they looked like a spark landing in dry grass. The Homietos didn't follow the usual playbook. They recruited from prisons, rural towns, and independent riding crews that had never been fully absorbed into the old hierarchy. Their pitch was simple: no permission, no tribute, no bowing to distant leadership. In regions long treated as Bandido overflow territory, that message landed hard. Riders who felt ignored or exploited listened. At first, the Bandidos tolerated the Homietos. Compared to threats like the Mongols or the Kinfolk, they seemed small. That changed when Homietos chapters began taking over drug corridors and weapons routes that had quietly fed Bandido networks for years. The shift wasn't loud, it was effective. And effectiveness is what draws attention in the outlaw world. By 2019, tension was impossible to ignore. Bar fights in Oklahoma City and Tulsa followed a familiar pattern. Homietos riders in one corner, Bandido associates in the other. Words exchanged, chairs moved. Someone was always left bleeding. Police reports called them isolated incidents. Insiders called them probes. Lee's strategy focused on alliances. The Homietos didn't try to fight alone. They aligned with smaller clubs and splinter groups, some already hostile to the Bandidos. Federal agents later described it as an opposition network, a loose coalition designed to resist Texas dominance. To the Bandidos, it looked like rebellion spreading through the plains. Violence escalated in 2021. Outside a bar near Fort Worth, 2 bikers were shot and killed, one tied to the homies, the other a known Bandido associate. Retaliation followed quickly. Vehicles burned, homes vandalized, warnings delivered without names attached. The message traveled faster than any press release. Lines had been crossed. The Bandidos responded with pressure rather than spectacle. Enforcers moved north. Support clubs were activated. Riders were warned about wearing the wrong colors in the wrong places. The goal wasn't annihilation. It was containment. Make the cost of expansion too high to justify the gain. Carl, Big Dog Lebsack, and the Pacific Shadow. Carl Big Dog Lebsack never chased territory the way other outlaw leaders did. He understood something most rivals ignored. You don't always win by being the loudest club on the road. Sometimes you win by being the one nobody sees coming. That philosophy defined the Gypsy Joker motorcycle club and turned them into one of the most unnerving enemies the Bandidos ever encountered along the Pacific coast. The Gypsy Jokers were smaller than the Bandidos, and they liked it that way. Based primarily in Washington and the Pacific Northwest, they avoided flashy expansion and public intimidation. Their power came from precision, secrecy, and an almost paranoid level of internal security. When the Bandidos began expanding westward, the Jokers didn't issue threats or challenge them openly. They watched. At first, the two clubs seemed destined to coexist. Different styles, different priorities. But the Pacific Northwest isn't neutral ground. It's a corridor, drug routes, weapons, pipelines, ports that matter. As Bandido chapters and affiliates started appearing closer to Joker territory, the tension shifted from passive to personal. The Jokers didn't ask permission, and they didn't tolerate intrusion. Unlike other rivalries, this one rarely erupted into public violence. That was deliberate. The Gypsy Jokers believed visibility was weakness. Instead, they used intimidation that left little evidence. Members were followed, meetings were compromised. Support clubs were quietly warned. In one widely discussed case within law enforcement circles, a Bandido-linked rider was found beaten and left miles from his bike, his vest removed, his message delivered without witnesses. Lebsack's leadership style fed the fear. He discouraged impulsive action and demanded absolute loyalty. The Jokers operated more like a covert unit than a biker club. Cells within cells, limited communication, constant counter-surveillance. For the Bandidos, used to structured hierarchy and visible dominance, this was deeply frustrating. There was no head to cut off, no clubhouse to pressure, no public mistake to exploit. By the late 2000s, federal agencies began paying closer attention to the Gypsy Jokers, especially after uncovering evidence of planned violence against rivals and law enforcement. Investigations revealed how deeply insulated the club was. Even under pressure, information rarely leaked. That same insulation made them dangerous to anyone who crossed them. For the Bandidos, the Jokers represented a different kind of enemy. Not empire builders, not rebels, hunters. The conflict stayed mostly underground, but that didn't make it less real. In Washington and Oregon, smaller clubs felt the strain first. They were forced to choose sides or step away from biker life entirely. Neutrality wasn't tolerated. What truly unnerved Bandido leadership was unpredictability. With other rivals, escalation followed patterns. With the Jokers, nothing did. Weeks of silence could end in sudden retaliation. Then, silence again. The lack of rhythm kept everyone on edge. No one knew when the next move was coming or where. Stephen McCraw and the Unseen Front. When law enforcement became the most dangerous enemy, Stephen McCraw never wore colors. He didn't ride in formation or announce territory. But to the Bandidos, he represented something far more dangerous than any rival patch. As the public face of Texas law enforcement during some of the club's bloodiest years, McCraw symbolized a kind of enemy that couldn't be intimidated, negotiated with, or waited out. While biker wars flared and cooled, this one never stopped. After Waco, the landscape changed permanently. The Twin Peaks massacre forced Texas to confront outlaw motorcycle violence at a scale it couldn't ignore. Public pressure was immediate. Political patience evaporated. McCraw, then leading the Texas Department of Public Safety, stepped into a spotlight that most lawmen avoid. He didn't downplay what happened. He framed it as organized violence, not a bar fight gone wrong. That framing mattered. It shifted the narrative from isolated incidents to a systemic threat. For the Bandidos, that shift was dangerous. Rival clubs could be deterred with fear. Law enforcement couldn't. McCraw pushed for aggressive intelligence gathering, surveillance, and coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. The result wasn't one dramatic raid, it was constant pressure. Roads became watched, clubhouses became mapped, movements became predictable. The old advantage of anonymity began to erode. Bandidos members noticed it first in small ways. Traffic stops that felt targeted. Patrol cars are lingering near known hangouts, a sense that every ride was being logged somewhere. What made McCraw's approach effective was restraint. He didn't chase headlines with mass arrests unless the cases were airtight. He emphasized building long-term cases, waiting for patterns, and letting rivalries expose networks. Every feud, every retaliation created data. And data was something outlaw culture wasn't built to hide. The Bandidos understood this threat instinctively. Law enforcement wasn't bound by pride or patch wars. It didn't care who won a territory dispute. It cared about dismantling structures. Unlike biker rivals, McCraw's strategy didn't rely on dominance. It relied on patience. The same patience that had allowed the Bandidos to grow now worked against them. For many members, the psychological toll was heavier than open war. You can prepare for a rival. You can watch the door. You can ride armed. You can't see surveillance. You can't predict subpoenas. You can't retaliate against indictments. Every knock on the door carried possibility. Every phone call felt listened to. McCraw's public statements reinforced the message. Texas would not tolerate organized biker violence. This wasn't a turf dispute to be managed. It was a criminal enterprise to be dismantled. To the Bandidos, it felt like the state itself had declared a position. Neutrality was gone.